Today's Amiga list starts with another light strategy game that can be considered a classic, at least among Amiga and DOS gamers. Ports of Call is a trading and shipping simulator which lets you do some, well, trading and shipping. You start by creating your own shipping company, for which you then have to choose a home port and buy some ships to perform the actual shipping with. Naturally, the ships need repairs and refueling between all the seafaring, but in case you choose to also captain your ships at the beginning of the game, then you also need to personally maneuver your ships in and out of docking bays and through treacherous waters whenever required. From today's point of view, and particularly when compared to other strategy simulations, Ports of Call is a rather low-budget and low-energy strategy game, which is exactly why I grew to like it back in the day. More to the point, this was probably my first actual strategy game that I enjoyed playing, which definitely opened up my eyes for further similar action. With a very loose definition on the word action, of course. For those of you who enjoy this sort of thing, you can actually find the classic Ports of Call on Steam, and it costs only about €4. For the more adventurous, the creator of the game has also written more modernized versions, the most recent of which was released in 2008, and they all can be found on the official Ports of Call website, a link for which is provided in the video description. A very different sort of a great 16-bit exclusive game from Elite was released for both Commodore Amiga and Atari ST, Dogs of War. A commando-like original shooter which has one of the most hilariously bad cover arts ever created. Happily, the game itself is much more impressive. Although it was originally designed for the Atari ST, both versions were released simultaneously, and I can't really see much of a difference between the two versions, which is why I never wrote about it on my blog, and which is exactly one of the reasons why I decided to do this video series in the first place. There's a few great things about Dogs of War, which makes it well worth checking out. The first and foremost reason for digging this up is that you can play it in a cooperative two-player mode, similarly to Ikari Warriors. While that's all great, the fun comes in the possibility of choosing your weapons for a vast selection of all sorts of things: pistols, submachine guns, miniguns, flamethrowers, grenades, bazookas, and what have you. The thing is, though, that since you play as mercenary warriors, you have a certain amount of money to buy your weaponry with to be used on a mission. Complete a mission and you will receive a bonus. Just so that the game becomes less bothersome with the usual linear style of most shooter games, the missions can be freely chosen from pointers on the world map. Also, for even more variety, the game switches between vertical and horizontal scrolling during each mission. If you're in need of great two-player games for your Amiga or ST, this is a highly recommendable one for your list. And seeing as it's a semi-exclusive one for the two rival 16-bits, it's a great game for either machine's nostalgic list. The inevitable racing game entry for today is Supercars II from Gremlin Graphics. Released in 1991, once again for both Amiga and Atari ST, Supercars II was such an evolved racing game with shoot-'em-up elements that it couldn't be realistically made for the 8-bits any longer, and while I didn't really realize this at the time, it was probably the first game to properly make me consider upgrading my gaming system at home from a C64 to something more modern. Not least because of the extremely effective soundtrack. Listen to this. Compared to the original Supercars, the sequel is grittier and more realistic in its overall style. The cars handle differently, although not exactly more realistically, but it still feels better than the first game. There are more weapons this time, with much more bullets and a much more detailed repair system. And you also get nitros into your car, instead of an expensive single turbocharger kit for each race, which I suspect was snatched from Ironman Stewart's Super Off-Road. Another new element is questionnaires between races, which can either earn you money or cost you, depending on your answers. But the biggest change in terms of longevity is the split-screen two-player mode, which made Supercars II one of the most revisited games on the Amiga in my youth. Experiencing the original game only after the sequel, you can imagine, was a spectacular letdown. That doesn't mean the first Supercars is not a good game, it's just not nearly as exciting as the sequel. And since you can only find Supercars II on the Amiga and ST, it only adds to the list of games that give you good reason to consider buying an Amiga or an ST. But it's the music for which I recommend the Amiga version more particularly. Back when Electronic Arts were still releasing good games for the most part, Bullfrog got their quirky puzzle platformer called Flood published through EA. It's one of the first platforming type games that I ever played on an Amiga, and it stuck to my head for being such an original concept, in which you were also able to climb the walls. The object of the game is basically to lead the protagonist, by the name of Quiffy, to the planet's surface while cleaning each stage of trash, but how you do it is more or less a matter of learning to recognize everything in different sets of graphics. The main focus is, naturally, on platform jumping and climbing, but you do get the occasional weapon, which will help you plow your way through the varying amounts of enemies. The tricky bit is getting your job done before the level gets flooded and you drown, but you'll get enough of practice in the first few levels to have a good chance of further survival. At least you can swim underwater for a brief period of time, which is indicated by the blue energy bar, and there is also a red energy bar that informs you of the amount of damage you are able to withhold. Flood is a pretty long and difficult platformer with 42 levels, but at least it features a password system with a 4-letter password for each level. However, the passwords are not given after each level, but instead you need to find an item that looks like a question mark. Not all levels even have such an item, but you can get passwords for different levels than the one you find a question mark from. It's really quite an odd little game, and it requires some digging into, but it's well worth a go. Since we started this episode with something that's currently available on Steam, let's end with another classic like that as well. Another World, which became known as Out of This World in North America, is perhaps not the earliest example of a cinematic action game, but it certainly pulled off the cinematic feel with proper interaction much better than any game prior to this. The game starts off with a lengthy animated opening sequence in the game's own graphical engine, which favors depth and realistic movement over details. Most of the game itself is side-viewed action platforming with puzzle elements, but there are some minor cutscenes scattered all over the game's narrative, which is a huge deal for a game of this age and size. Another World came on only 2 floppy disks, you see. And for that space, this is a very lengthy game, which is only emphasized by having only one life. A few checkpoints and slightly clunky controls that don't always work like a dream. But compared to previous games like Karateka or Dragon Slayer, Another World was on a completely new level in every sense. The impact this game had on more modern cinematic action games is clear, and it deserves to be revisited every now and then, most particularly on the original platforms it was released on, Atari ST and Commodore Amiga. But some of you might want to take an easier route and buy the latest anniversary edition on Steam or GOG or any other digital game store that has it. You won't be too far off from the original that way either.